Debbie, time is 12 minutes past 9. You're under arrest on suspicion of murder. You don't have to say anything but may harm in defence. Don't mention one question, something for the court.
What do you mean? I'm
anything you do say,
suspicion of
given
murder.
evidence.
What do you mean? I'm in suspicion?
Right, just stay sat there.
What do you mean?
In the idyllic coastal resort town of Bournemouth, England, life typically moves at a gentle pace. Tourists stroll along the sandy shores, families enjoy the charming piers, and the sound of waves provides a constant, soothing rhythm. But in the late summer of 2023, this tranquility was shattered by a series of discoveries so gruesome they seemed torn from the pages of a horror novel. The community was about to learn that a darkness far deeper than the ocean lay hidden just beneath the surface of their picturesque town. It began on a drizzly afternoon. A local woman named Dana Burton was distributing flyers along the seafront, hurrying to finish her work before the weather worsened. Seeking temporary refuge from a sudden downpour, she ducked under a large tree near the manor steps, a well-trodden zigzag path leading down to the beach. As she waited for the rain to subside, a foul, unfamiliar smell assaulted her senses. Her eyes scanned the ground and settled on a strange package, wrapped crudely and left near the base of the tree. Curiosity mingled with a sense of unease. As the rain let up, she decided to continue her route, but the image of the strange package and its putrid odor lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. A short while later, compelled by a nagging premonition, she circled back to the tree. The rain had partially soaked and loosened the wrapping of the package. Peering closer, her blood ran cold. Protruding from the sodden layers was something she could barely comprehend. Something unmistakably human. It was a foot. Panic seized her, and with trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and dialed the police. The call set in motion a grim and methodical search. Responding officers secured the area, their faces grim as they confirmed Dana's horrific discovery. Their search expanded, combing through the seaside foliage and the surrounding pathways. Soon, they found another human leg not far from the first. The investigation escalated into a full-scale operation, casting a dark shadow over the town. 6 days later, the search led them to Boscombe Chine Gardens, a public park a short distance away. An officer, guided by what he described as the unmistakable and perverse smell of death, was drawn to a discarded black suitcase. Inside, police found the headless, limbless torso of a man. The tranquil resort town had become the setting for a monstrous crime, and investigators now faced the daunting task of identifying the victim and finding the person or people responsible for such a barbaric act. Forensic experts worked tirelessly, and through DNA, they were finally able to put a name to the fragmented remains. The victim was 49-year-old Simon Shotten, a man whose life had been a long and difficult journey, marked by struggles that had ultimately led him into the orbit of his killers. Simon's story was not one of privilege or stability. From an early age, he seemed to be searching for a place to belong, a path that felt right. He never settled into a singular career, instead drifting between various jobs. He did agency work, labored in warehouses, and for a time even found a sense of fleeting joy working the bright lights and noisy chaos of a fairground. While his professional life lacked a steady foundation, the cornerstone of his world was his family. He deeply loved his son, Wesley, and his mother, and he fought to maintain contact with them no matter how dire his own circumstances became. The great shadow looming over Simon's life was a severe and unrelenting addiction to substances and alcohol. This dependency dragged him into a chaotic existence, often leaving him homeless and vulnerable on the streets. He carried the weight of his addiction like a secret burden, doing everything in his power to shield his loved ones from its ugliest realities. His son Wesley, who was just 19 when his father was murdered, remembers Simon not for his struggles, but for his love. He wasn't always present, Wesley would later recall, but the moments we did share together were precious. They bonded over a shared passion for motorsport, moments of normalcy and connection that stood in stark contrast to the turmoil Simon faced alone. Simon's love for his family was his primary motivation. It was the reason he made repeated, desperate attempts to break free from his addictions, to become the father and son he so badly wanted to be. Those who knew him beyond the context of his dependencies consistently described him as a kind, gentle, and warm-hearted man, a soul lost in a storm he couldn't escape. But addiction is a cruel master. It drove Simon to commit petty crimes to fund his habit, which in turn led him into a spiral of debt with dangerous dealers. Unemployed and penniless, he became trapped. In a desperate bid to survive, he took on the role of a mule, transporting illicit substances across county lines for the very people who held him in their debt. It was a perilous and thankless job. His only payment was more of the substances he was trying so desperately to escape, tightening the chains of his addiction and making it nearly impossible to break free. Eventually, the law caught up with him. Simon was arrested while working as a mule and sentenced to time in Norwich prison. Upon his release in September of 2022, the probation services, recognizing the immense danger of him returning to his old environment, made a crucial decision. They relocated him to Dorset in the southwest of England, hoping that the physical distance from his old life would give him a fighting chance. It was an attempt to sever his ties to the debts, the dealers, and the overwhelming temptations that awaited him. For a brief time, it seemed like a fresh start was possible. Initially, Simon was homeless, living on the streets of Bournemouth, but he soon found a precarious form of shelter in a derelict hotel. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over his head. Sadly, the demons of his past were relentless. He relapsed, and the familiar, destructive cycle began all over again. He slipped back into the life of a mule, dealing on the streets for 12 hours at a time, receiving his only payment in the very poison that was destroying him. He meticulously hid this new, illicit employment from his probation officers, knowing that if they found out, he would be sent straight back to prison. His health began to decline rapidly. The long hours exhausted him, and his body was in constant pain. He suffered from COPD, a chronic lung disease that left him breathless, and a previous injury meant he was unable to properly use his right arm. By August of 2023, his precarious world collapsed once more. He was evicted from the derelict hotel, leaving him utterly desperate and with nowhere to turn. In his desperation, he reached out for help from a couple he knew through his dealings on the street, 49-year-old Benjamin Atkins and 39-year-old Debbie Pereira. This decision would prove to be fatal. The couple lived together in a small, rented flat, a space already strained by their own chaotic lives. All three of them, Simon, Ben, and Debbie, were bound by the common threads of severe substance and alcohol addiction. They struck a grim, transactional arrangement. Simon was allowed to sleep in a tent in the garden of their flat. In exchange, he had to provide them with £40 worth of substances every single day. The rules were strict. He had to leave the property during the day, but he was permitted to come inside in the evenings to use the shower and bathroom. On occasion, if the weather was particularly bad, he was allowed to sleep on the sofa. This living situation was a tinderbox. 3 volatile lives, each entwined with chaos and desperation, were now crammed under one small roof. It was a volatile mixture of dependency, poverty, and trauma that was destined to ignite. Within 2 short weeks of moving into that garden, Simon Shotten would be brutally murdered. Like Simon, both Debbie Pereira and Benjamin Atkins were products of deeply troubled pasts. Debbie's story began with a sense of abandonment. Adopted by her aunt, she grew up in the shadow of her cousins, feeling unloved and overlooked, constantly starved for the affection she saw lavished upon them. Her childhood was further marred by horrific abuse. Her stepfather subjected her to brutal physical beatings, while his friends subjected her to the unspeakable trauma of sexual abuse. These early experiences warped her perception of relationships, setting a pattern for the future. As she entered adulthood, she found herself in a series of toxic relationships with men who continued the cycle of physical and emotional abuse, leaving her deeply scarred, both inside and out. At the age of 29, one of these partners introduced her to heroin, and her life spiraled into a swift and devastating addiction. She was a mother to 2 children who were now teenagers, but her relationship with them was infrequent and strained, another casualty of her chaotic lifestyle. There had been a period where Debbie managed to achieve sobriety, a glimmer of hope for a different life. But that hope was extinguished when an ex-boyfriend, Benjamin Atkins, re-entered her life. Together, they quickly descended back into the depths of their shared addiction. Ben's own history was steeped in violence. His stepfather had routinely beaten him with severe, terrifying force. As a young man, he was swept up in the rave scene of the 1990s, a world that introduced him to hard drugs and led him down a path of addiction and crime. For a time, however, Ben had managed to pull himself out of that spiral. Following the death of his beloved grandmother, he found the motivation to turn his life around. He learned a trade, becoming a skilled carpenter, and for a while he lived a stable, productive life with a new partner. But when that relationship ended while he was living in Bristol, his life began to crumble once more. It was then that he reconnected with his old flame, Debbie. He traveled to Bournemouth to visit her, and almost immediately moved into her small flat. Like Debbie, Ben had children from a previous relationship with whom he had little to no contact. At the very beginning, the grim arrangement between the trio seemed to function. Simon had a place to stay, albeit in a tent in the garden, and Ben and Debbie received their daily payment of substances. In a twisted way, everyone seemed to be getting what they needed. But the fragile peace did not last long. The dynamic quickly soured and turned predatory. Ben, not content with the daily supply of drugs, began to borrow money from Simon, money he had no intention of ever paying back. To keep the peace and prevent explosive confrontations, Debbie would often step in and repay Simon herself. An emotional power play also began to unfold. Ben was frequently abusive towards Debbie, both verbally and physically, and Simon, with his inherently kind nature, took great offense to this. He would try to stand up for her, offering a shoulder to lean on. Debbie, in turn, accepted Simon's sympathy, using him as an emotional cushion. But at the end of the day, her loyalty remained with Ben, the man she felt her heart belonged to, creating a toxic triangle of manipulation and resentment. Soon, Ben's demands escalated. The £40 worth of substances a day was no longer enough. He began to blackmail Simon, demanding more drugs and money, all while making sure Debbie didn't find out about the extent of his extortion. Ben held the ultimate threat over Simon's head. He knew Simon was working as a mule. He threatened to report Simon to his parole officers, a call that would guarantee Simon's immediate return to prison. Simon was trapped, his fear and desperation mounting with each passing day. The manipulation and abuse only grew worse. On the night of August 18th, 2023, the tension in the small flat was palpable. Simon sat in his tent, frantically texting a friend named Donna. He confessed his growing terror, telling her that he no longer felt safe at the flat and desperately needed to find a new place to stay. He explained the blackmail, the constant pressure from Ben. That evening, all 3 of them were high, their judgment clouded by a haze of substances. Ben and Debbie wanted more, but they had no money, so they concocted a cruel plan. Debbie would distract Simon, luring him into a conversation, while Ben snuck into Simon's belongings and stole what little money he had. The plan worked. At around 4:30 in the morning, Ben and Debbie slipped out of the flat and went to score more drugs. It didn't take long for Simon to realize he had been robbed. A cold, furious rage washed over him. When the couple returned around 7 a.m., high and indifferent, Simon confronted them. Ben, arrogant and dismissive, just laughed in his face. He and Debbie then retreated into their bedroom, locking the door and consuming all the newly acquired drugs between themselves, leaving Simon outside, seething with anger and a growing sense of dread. Simon was anxiously waiting to be picked up for his 12-hour shift as a mule. He sent another text message to his ride, begging them to come earlier than planned. "I feel unsafe," he wrote, a premonition of violence hanging heavy in the air. He knew something terrible was about to happen. In a burst of impotent rage, Simon took a knife and cut the television cables in the flat. He then retreated to the small utility room to wait for his ride, his heart pounding in his chest. No one except for Benjamin Atkins knows for certain what happened next in that cramped utility room. Ben would later claim he acted in self-defense, a claim starkly contradicted by the evidence. It is speculated that Simon, perhaps anticipating a violent confrontation, may have armed himself with the same knife he had just used to cut the TV wires. But this is only a guess, a possible explanation for how the struggle began. The physical evidence left behind painted a brutal and desperate picture. Blood spatter from both men was found on the walls and the ceiling, a testament to the violence of the struggle. Both Simon and Ben had defensive wounds on their hands, suggesting a ferocious fight for control of the weapon. The confrontation escalated with terrifying speed. Ben, physically stronger, managed to overpower Simon and wrench the knife from his grasp. Once he had the weapon, any semblance of control vanished, replaced by a frenzied, murderous rage. He began to swing the knife ferociously. Simon raised his arms to defend himself, and the blade cut deep into his hands and forearms, leaving multiple defensive stab wounds. But Ben was relentless. He lunged forward, stabbing Simon in the chest, not once, but multiple times. In excruciating pain, Simon turned, trying to shield himself, but Ben continued his vicious assault, plunging the knife deep into Simon's back and shoulders with powerful, deliberate strikes. Overcome by a terrifying rage, Ben didn't stop even then. As Simon collapsed to the floor, wounded and dying, Ben's assault became even more depraved. He straddled Simon's chest and picked up a large, heavy speaker. He then began to brutally smash it into Simon's skull, again and again and again, until every last sign of life had been extinguished. In a final, gruesome act of utter contempt, once Simon was dead, Ben leaned down and gouged out his victim's eye with his thumb. Debbie, who had hidden in the bedroom during the terrifying sounds of the murder, emerged only when the flat fell deathly silent. She cautiously entered the utility room and was met with a scene of unimaginable horror. She found Ben still sitting on Simon's lifeless, brutalized body. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood. The scene was made even more surreal and chilling when Ben turned, looked up at her with a vacant expression, and said flatly, "He's pissed himself." There was no thought of calling an ambulance, no moment of panic or remorse. Simon was simply left for dead on the utility room floor. The very first thing the couple did next was to take Simon's crack pipe and smoke the remaining residue from inside it. For a few hours, they sat in the front room, getting high while Simon's body lay just feet away. Fueled by their renewed high and the ever-present craving for more, they decided they needed to score again. They rifled through Simon's few belongings, taking what little money he had left. They also took his bicycle and his phone. Debbie, having figured out Simon's PIN code, unlocked the phone and re-registered it in her own name so they could sell it. They pawned his possessions for drug money, returned to the flat, and got high again, pushing the reality of what they had done to the furthest corners of their minds. It was only the next day, in the stark, unforgiving light of morning, that they acknowledged the grim task ahead. They had to get rid of Simon's body. Ben dragged Simon's corpse out of the utility room and into the back garden, covering it with a tarpaulin. The couple then went out and stole cleaning supplies and a hacksaw. Debbie, who suffered from obsessive-compulsive disorder, immediately set about meticulously cleaning the flat. Her compulsive need for cleanliness became a tool to erase the evidence, a sharp, disturbing contrast to the utter chaos of their crime. While she scrubbed, Ben attempted a more crude cover-up. He borrowed some magnolia paint from a neighbor and simply painted over the bloodstains on the walls. Over the next few days, Debbie continued her thorough, obsessive cleaning, while Ben undertook a far more gruesome task. He had acquired a book on anatomy, and using it as a grotesque guide, he began the macabre process of dismembering Simon's body. Waiting for the cover of darkness, he worked in the garden. gruesomely sawing off Simon's head, followed by his legs, and then his arms. Ben was convinced that he could dispose of the evidence by simply burning it. He started a large fire in a makeshift incinerator in the backyard and threw in Simon's clothes and his severed head. However, he had grossly underestimated the reality of such an act. The smell of burning flesh, a putrid and deeply unsettling odor, soon permeated the air and wafted over the neighbors' fences. The horrific stench was unlike anything they had ever smelled before. Horrified and suspicious, they complained. Ben, a practiced liar, managed to convince them that the smell was from a dead fox he had found in his garden and that he was simply burning the carcass. For 2 futile days, he attempted to incinerate Simon's head using various accelerants to try and intensify the fire, but the flames were never hot enough to fully consume the remains. He needed a new plan. The discovery of Simon's remains at the seafront and in Boscombe Chine Gardens led investigators on a determined path. A breakthrough came when detectives traced the sale of Simon's mobile phone back to a local pawn shop. The transaction records led them directly to Debbie Pereira and Benjamin Atkins, making them the prime suspects. Police descended on the small flat, and as they searched the property, they found the final damning piece of evidence they needed: Simon's severed arms wrapped in bin bags, hidden in the garden. The couple were arrested on suspicion of murder. Placed in the back of a police van, they were unaware that a secret microphone was recording their every word. The conversation that followed was a chilling window into their remorseless minds. "Do you regret anything?" Debbie asked Ben quietly. Ben's reply was immediate and terrifying. "I'll look him straight in the eye and say, 'Yeah, I'll do it again and again and again. If you let me go today, I'd find another one and do it again. Substance dealers and pushers kill, decapitate, and eat the fucker.'" He then spoke about the moment of their arrest when the police were searching the garden. "I went into the garden to get rid of the fucking arms," he said matter-of-factly. He went on to make a truly monstrous claim to Debbie, boasting that he had cooked Simon's head and eaten his cheeks. For her part, Debbie expressed no horror or disgust. Her only concern was for herself. She was worried, she told Ben, that the police might find traces of blood under her fingernails. Their conversation showed a complete and utter lack of remorse, a chilling detachment from the horrific violence they had perpetrated. During interrogation, officers pressed Ben on the whereabouts of Simon's head. Only small fragments had ever been recovered from the garden fire pit. Ben insisted that he had burned it completely, claiming the skull and teeth had turned to ash, a statement forensic experts confirmed was impossible without an industrial crematorium. To this day, Simon's head is still missing, denying his family the dignity of a proper burial. In a bizarre and twisted moment, Ben even asked his solicitor if admitting to eating Simon's head would get him off the hook, a question that revealed the depths of his depraved and manipulative thinking. In court, the evidence against them was overwhelming. Ben Atkins was found guilty of murder, perverting the course of justice and preventing the burial of a corpse. He was given a life sentence with a minimum term of 19 years. Debbie Pereira was found guilty of perverting the course of justice, having already admitted to preventing the burial of a corpse. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison. After the sentencing, Ben offered a hollow, self-serving apology. "I wouldn't have done that if I wasn't under the influence," he claimed. "I wouldn't have cut him up. I was scared. I was traumatized. I was panicked. I was under extreme stress as well as under the influence. What I'd done was truly awful. It's horrendous what I have done, and I deserve to be punished. I'm sorry to his family. I'm sorry to my family." He then added a chilling caveat. "It's difficult for me to be remorseful to a man who was trying to kill me in my own house." The final, most poignant words belong to Simon's son, Wesley. In a powerful victim impact statement, he faced his father's killers, his voice heavy with grief and anger. "Your children should be ashamed of what you have done," he said. "You wrecked many more lives than just my dad's. No sentence will ever be enough for what you have done. there is nothing I can say that can truly capture what you have left me feeling. You knew what you were doing. Whatever others may have thought of him, he was my dad, loved beyond words and irreplaceable to me. I never liked the idea of Dad being involved in substances, but despite his struggles, he was my dad, who I was proud of. Wesley's words reclaimed his father's humanity from the monstrous narrative created by his killers. This was not just a story about addiction and violence, it was a story about the loss of a father, a son, and a kind-hearted man who was seen by his predators as nothing more than an easy target, an obstacle to their next high. When he finally stood up to them, they didn't just silence him. They obliterated him in the most brutal way imaginable, a tragic and horrifying end to a life already filled with so much pain. Well, that concludes today's video. I truly hope this gave you valuable insight into some of the most overlooked cases throughout the years. If you found this helpful, please consider liking, subscribing, and turning on notifications to stay updated. Thanks again for your time and support. There's more on the way, so stay tuned.